This video is an exam review problem to help you prepare for exam 1. Let's get right to it. Peggy Bundy is 46 years old, unmarried, mother of 2. What notes would you write about this? I would write that she's either single, head of household, or widow, okay? I would tell you now that your exam will involve qualifying widow. So be sure you know the rules to qualify as a widow filing status. The information is shown for you here in your textbook. In the year of death of the spouse, the taxpayer files as married filing jointly, as if still married. Then it's the next 2 years after the year of death that the taxpayer may file as widow if qualified. Again, in the year of death of the spouse, the taxpayer files as married filing jointly. Then the next 2 years, the taxpayer may file as widow if qualified. And to qualify, the widow must pay over half of the cost of maintaining a household for the taxpayer's dependent. And why would the taxpayer want to qualify as a widow filing status? To benefit from the joint filing status. The joint filing status has a lower tax liability than single filing status and also lower tax liability than head of household filing status. Now back to the exam review problem. Peggy is a mother of 2 and her children could qualify as qualifying child or qualifying relative or none at all, in which case she would be single. If having children, then the dependents may qualify her for child tax credit as much as $2,000, remember? If not, then the children could qualify for credit for other dependents, which would be $500. We do not know if her children meets the qualifications. That's just the process, the thinking right now from the information that we're given. We'll know more about her children and we determine the qualifications later. She has earned income as shown on her W-2 that needs to be reported on 1040 line 1, and she has prepayment of tax that needs to be reported on line 17 of 1040. She has ordinary dividends totaling $1,750. Where is that reported on Form 1040? Look at Form 1040, and if you do not know, go back to sample problem 1. We had this already. Very important. The problem tells us that the dividends from Southern Company are qualified dividends. Where is qualified dividends reported? Line 3A. What's more important is knowing why is it qualified dividends and what are the implications for filing individual tax here. I will tell you first, qualified dividends are ordinary dividends because all dividends are ordinary dividends. 2, it is qualified dividends because dividends from holding stock of a U.S. company and holding this stock for over 60 days, these 2 factors make it a qualified dividends. As qualified dividends, its income is subject to a lower tax rate. We call that the capital gains rate. Lower tax rate than the ordinary income tax rate. And so we reported in line 3A. One more important note here. Because the taxpayer has qualified dividends for line 12A, the tax liability, do not look up the tax based on the taxable income from line 11B. Again, if there is qualified dividends for line 12A, do not look up the tax based on the taxable income from line 11B. You must use the worksheet called Qualified Dividends and Capital Gains Tax Worksheet to get the amount. It helps you to calculate the amount of tax for line 12A. If you do not know the reason why, please go back to sample problem 1, the videos on sample problem 1. Back to the review problem. Peggy has 2 children, Kelly and Bud. Look at the birth date and determine the age. See if they qualified as qualifying child, or if not, maybe as qualifying relative, and it would be the $500 for the other dependent. Otherwise, the child tax credit of up to $2,000. Or her children may not qualify her for any credits if they do not pass all of the tests to be a qualifying child, qualifying relative. It states, Kelly and Bud lived with Peggy for the entire year, and Peggy paid all costs associated with the apartment in which they live, as well as all items of support for both children. So the support test passed. During 2019, Peggy paid $2,600 to KidCare. Peggy also paid $1,200 to Robin Gigglesworth for the care of Kelly while she worked weekends during the tax season. This information relates to child and dependent care expenses credit. Fill out Form 2441 if applicable. It would determine how much is the qualified expense and how much of those qualified expense based on income level would qualify for the credit. Determine how much the credit is. We had done this in a previous sample problem. Bud began attending Lanier Technical College in August of 2019. He received a 1098T and his total expenses for tuition, fees, and books were $1,600. He received reimbursement from a scholarship of $1,200 for these amounts. Scholarships would reduce the amount of qualified expense for any education credits, okay? So note that. Now, Kelly and Bud, her 2 children, if they qualify to be her dependents, fill out Form 1040, the information on dependents, in the top section of Form 1040. Here it is. How many of her 2 children are dependents? And then whether they qualify for the child tax credit or credit for other dependents. We had talked about qualified dividends earlier, line 3, 3A and 3B, ordinary dividends. And remember, Schedule B, if required, we need to fill that out. It's required if either taxable interest or dividends is more than $1,500. In this problem, we have dividends from Southern Company that are qualified dividends. So we must fill out the qualified dividends and capital gains tax worksheet, line 12A. Populate this worksheet, and at the bottom, we get line 27, which then carry over to line 12A. Line 12A is the amount of tax. To give you a hint, the amount on the qualified dividends and capital gains tax worksheet, line 1 here, should be $21,400. That is from the 1040 line 11B. Line 11B is taxable income. So fill out line 1, $21,400, and the remainder of this worksheet in order to get the amount for line 12B on Form 1040. Is there child and dependent care credit in this problem? Right here. If there is, then fill out Form 2441. List the 2 care providers here, the address, social security number, and the amount paid. See how much those are and how much is the qualified expenses. Populate here. Whatever is the qualified expenses, it's subject to a limit of $3,000 per qualifying person, or $6,000 for 2 or more. So here we would input $3,000 if it's 1, and then enter the earned income in line 4. If married filing jointly, it's subject to a limitation of the spouse's income. Jump down to line 7, report the amount from line 8B on Form 1040. That is the AGI, because we need the AGI to determine the rate. In this case, what is the rate? 22%, right? 22% based on AGI, and then 22% times the $3,000, the amount of qualified expense. We will get that for line 9. Then in line 10, it's the tax liability limit. We need to figure out that amount from the credit limit worksheet. It's part of the instructions for Form 2441. Basically, it is to see how much amount of this child and dependent care credit that we can use, how much of this credit we can apply. No other credits, as shown as a 0 here, is applied to this tax liability. Therefore, the full amount of the tax liability is available. So the child and dependent care credit from Form 2441 can be applied to this tax liability of $2174. And what is the amount of the child and dependent care expense credit? It would be the amount that you figured out for line 11 here on this Form 2441. Then report on Schedule 3 the amount from line 11 carried over to Schedule 3. Schedule 3 has a total which then carry over reported on 1040, line 13B. Next, back to the review problem. Bud began attending the school and received 1098T, tuition, fees, books, $1,600 minus the scholarship received. So then the qualified expense would be $400. How much of this qualified expense will be qualified for the credit, the education credit? Let's see. Let's think about this for a moment. It's the first year of Bud Bundy's college. So would it be American Opportunity Credit or Lifetime Learning Credit? And in either one, we would know from filling out Part 3 for each student, right? In this case, it's just one, Bud Bundy. Be sure to fill it out, and then you would know whether it's the American Opportunity Credit or qualify as Lifetime Learning Credit. You will come down to line 30 and know that it's going to be $400 as we indicated before as the qualified expense, and in this case as part of the American Opportunity Credit. And then go back to Part 1 and 2. Fill out Part 1 and 2. You will see that the $400 goes here. That's the qualified expense. Then go through the rest of the form to determine how much of this qualified expense, if any, is subject to phased out, and how much of the credit is refundable and how much is non-refundable. The refundable portion gets reported on line 18C of Form 1040. $160 goes there. And the non-refundable gets reported first on Schedule 3. Fill out this form on your own. I only input certain numbers here to make my point. On here, line 19 gets reported here and on Schedule 3. Schedule 3 is all non-refundable credit. So far, we have on line 2 the $660 child and dependent care credit. Now the lifetime learning credit, $240, so the total is $900. $900 gets carried over to 1040, line 13B. The taxpayer had 2 children dependents, right? One qualified as a qualifying child, and so would qualify for the child tax credit, which we would input 1 here, and number 1 would be $2,000. The other child, although is a child of the taxpayer, but because of age, would qualify for other dependent as a qualifying relative. So $500 goes here. Fill out the rest of the form. Come down to line 8, which would be yes. And line 8 is $2,500, which is the total amount of possible credits for this tax credit, this child tax credit and credit for other dependents, the $2,000 and the $500. Do Part 2, page 2 of this worksheet to determine how much of the $2,500 as qualified for tax credit could be used, could be applied to the tax liability. And the tax liability is input here, line 12B. How much of this liability has credits from Schedule 3 already applied to it? And from Schedule 3, remember the $660 and the $240, the Child Independent Care Credit and the LLC Education Credit. That totals $900, enter on line 10. So subtract line 10 from line 9, you would get line 11. Line 12 tells you that this is your child tax credit and credit for other dependents. and the remaining portion of the child tax credit and credit for other dependents, the $2,500, the remaining portion could be additional child tax credit. Child tax credit is reported on line 13A. The additional child tax credit refundable portion is reported on line 18B. Here's Schedule 8812, additional child tax credit, because from doing the worksheet, we know that we could have additional child tax credit. So let's fill it out. Line 1 starts off with the total of the child tax credit and credit for other dependents that we could be qualified for, and how much of that was used up? $1,274. The child tax credit and credit for other dependents. So how much is remaining? $1,226. Now, would we qualify for all of this as the additional child tax credit? Possibly. We know that this credit, the additional child tax credit, is a refundable credit. It has a limit of $1,400, so that's what we see here on line 4, and also it's subject to 15% of earned income over $2,500. And line 4, 5, 6, and 7 goes through those steps to determine whether we meet the threshold, whether we are under the limit. Please go through it and you determine that the amount of additional child tax credit will be $1,226. So the remainder of the balance, $1,226, does qualify for additional child tax credit. Report here and on line 18B of Form 1040. Are there anything else in this problem? Are there any other credits? There is one more credit. That is the earned income credit. Go through this worksheet, steps 1 through 6, to see if the taxpayer qualifies for this earned income credit, which is meant to support the low-income taxpayers. The result of step 6 for this problem will tell you to go to worksheet A. Worksheet A will help you determine your amount of earned income credit. And this earned income credit amount is obtained from Appendix B. It's based on looking up the earned income, so that's line 1, $38,000, or the AGI, $39,750. You look up the earned income credit based on each of those, and then it's the smaller of the two. You will know all that by completing worksheet A. Finally, for the earned income credit with any qualifying child, fill out the qualifying child information. In this case, there are 2 children. Please take time to review all of the sample problems, including this exam review problem, on your own. Understand each steps, the instructions, the forms, the problem, how to analyze, what you should write down for notes, and then process the information where it goes on the forms, why you are inputting the numbers that you are inputting. And very important is to take the time to check your work. Make sure that you filled out everything, there isn't anything that's missing, and that it all makes sense.